So, you've built an awesome app or game that's become a huge success with hundreds of thousands or millions of users worldwide.
You and your team are so very proud since this app has been your baby for the past few months, probably even years. But we all know it comes at some point.
Yep, it's time to monetize using ads or other revenue generating strategies, such as providing virtual currency like gems or coins for purchase. But figuring out the best way to optimize your app revenue can be confusing. You might have even had a meeting that goes a little something like this.
Oh, hey, great job in that game you built. But you know that saying, money talks? Well, I don't really feel like your game is talking enough. We got to make some more money. So, why don't you put in some more ads, like lots of ads, so many ads. Oh, but don't put in too many ads. We don't want to drive users away. Also, why don't we put in some of them fancy rewarded ads too, right? Like give players some gems when they watch a video. Like make it a lot of gems so they're really incentivized to watch an ad. Oh, but don't give away so many gems people stop paying for them. That'd be a disaster and people would probably get fired, specifically you two. Anyway, I think that was pretty clear guidance, so I'll let you get back to it. I'm a really good manager.
Okay, so obviously that scenario is a bit of an exaggeration, but our fictional manager is right. Also, hi Todd. If you've got a smash game or app out there, it's only fair that you generate some revenue for providing a great experience to your users. In our fictional scenario, our team has a game with two revenue streams: in app purchases of gems, as well as ads that give away some free gems as a reward for watching the ad. The question is, how can we make the changes requested by our manager without negatively affecting our revenue streams and our user experience? These are complicated problems to solve.
What our team needs is an easy way to measure, test, and validate proposed changes to our ad strategy. Ideally, that process should also only expose these changes to a small subset of users so that we can optimize our ad strategy before rolling them out to the entire user base. And that's exactly why we're here. We think we can help. I'm Rachel Saunders.
And I'm Sumit Chandel. Thank you all for joining our virtual Firebase 2020 session. In this video, we're going to learn how to test out ad experiences and how to optimize ad revenue using Google AdMob together with Firebase. Let's get started.
Okay, so let's go back to our manager's requests and let's parse what they said into actual questions for implementing a new ad strategy. The first question we should answer is, what's the impact of showing more ads to our users? Specifically, we want to optimize ad revenue while maintaining our current user retention. And the second question is, what is the optimal reward amount, the number of gems, to give away in our rewarded ads? Now, with the second question, we're also looking at how our ad strategy impacts our other revenue stream, users purchasing gems directly. And to answer these two questions, we're going to use a combination of Google AdMob and Google Analytics, along with Firebase Remote Config and Firebase A/B testing. Hey, Smith, you think you could tell us a little bit about how all these products work together?
Well, certainly, Rachel. First off, Google AdMob is how we create and serve ads to our users. Second, we're going to use Google Analytics to measure the impact of different ad strategies on key metrics like user retention, ad revenue, and in-app purchase revenue. And finally, we'll use Firebase Remote Config and Firebase A/B testing to test and compare different ad strategies by first exposing them to only a small subset of our user audience. This framework will allow us to answer both of our questions and beyond. Now, before we can get to answering those top-level questions that Rachel mentioned, we'll need to spend just a few minutes explaining how our framework is going to work. For now, let me pass it back to Rachel to tell us a bit more about using Google AdMob and Google Analytics.
As mentioned earlier, our game is already serving a rewarded ad via AdMob. But if you haven't used AdMob before, go ahead and check out the links in the description to get started and create your very first rewarded ad. We'll be waiting for you right here. Once you do have AdMob set up, you might notice that your account already shows some user metrics automatically collected for your ads. But we can do even more with automatically collected ads data by using the Firebase SDK for Google Analytics. It has a lot of useful features just by itself, but Google Analytics also powers Firebase Remote Config and A/B testing, so we'll be able to optimize the ad experience for different users. Setting up Google Analytics is pretty straightforward. Just check out the Getting Started docs, which are linked in the description. After getting set up, you'll automatically start seeing metric reports like these in the Firebase console. These help us to measure the impact of different tested ad experiences. But how exactly are we going to serve those different ad experiences to our users? Well, let's kick it back over to Sumit to describe the Firebase products that'll help us accomplish just that.
Okay, first, let's start with Firebase A-B testing. Or better yet, let me provide a brief overview of A-B testing as a concept. The whole idea with A-B testing is that you have multiple variants of something you want to test, like a feature, an app flow, or an app layout, and you want to compare them side by side to determine which one works best based on a set of key metrics. For example, in a space shooting game, you might want to A-B test which version of the game your players enjoy most. The easier variant, where players have ship shields up and fewer alien monsters to fight, or the more challenging version, with fewer power-ups and a lot more monsters. But in order to test these variants, we also need a way to create and deploy them to smaller user segments of our total user audience. And that's where Firebase Remote Config comes in. If you haven't used Remote Config before, you can think of it as a set of key value pairs that live in the cloud and that can overwrite default values already in our app based on different conditions and targeting of specific users. For example, maybe you have a new branding style that you want users to start seeing on a specific date. Well, you can configure that in the Firebase console, and on that date, each app instance will pull in and start displaying your new brand. This is a really powerful feature that allows you to change the look and feel of your app dynamically through the cloud without requiring any code updates or redeploys to the Play or App stores. This ability to target specific user segments and deploy different user experiences dynamically is what empowers Firebase A-B testing to perform A-B tests on different app variants and report on the resulting key metrics. And with that last piece in place, we've got our framework ready to start answering some of our questions.
Awesome. So let's start with our first question. Can we show more ads without negatively impacting our metrics? Well, to answer this question, we're going to need some A and B variants to test. And we actually already have one variant, our existing rewarded ad. What we need is a second variant, meaning a second rewarded ad that's set to display more often than that first ad. To create this second ad, let's go over into our AdMob account and select our existing AdMob app. Now, real quick, make sure this bit right here about linking to Firebase is done in your own app. Without this link, there's no communication between AdMob and Firebase and Google Analytics. And without those comms, you can't do any of the optimization testing later on. So if you haven't linked it yet, take a moment to do that now before the next step. Now, let's go ahead and look at our existing rewarding ad by clicking on the Ad Units section and viewing it here in the Ad Listings view. It has a name and an Ad Unit ID, and that ID is going to be really important later on when setting up testing with Firebase, so make sure to remember where to find it. The other important part of this ad is right here in the advanced settings, specifically frequency capping, which controls how many ads are shown to a user over a given time interval. And as you might guess, we'll use this setting to differentiate our two ads. In this existing ad, we're showing one impression per user per 20 minutes. So maybe for our second ad, we could up this frequency to one ad every 5 minutes instead. Now, hopefully that many ads won't degrade our user experience, but our Firebase testing will actually help us find that out. Let's go ahead and create that second ad, which will be our second variant for testing with Firebase. We're still here in the Ad Unit section, and we just need to click Add Ad Unit. We'll select Rewarded Ad and name this second ad Rewarded Ad More Ads. We'll keep the number of rewarded gems the same as the first ad, which was 1,000, but in the advanced settings, we'll enable and set frequency capping to one impression every 5 minutes instead of one impression every 20 minutes like we had in our original ad. And now we're done. Before leaving though, don't forget to take note of where to find that Ad Unit ID. Now we need to actually do something with these two ads. Smith, could you help us out?
For sure. So let's talk about those ad unit IDs Rachel just asked you to remember. So an ad unit ID represents the ad itself. Having different ad units IDs is what enables our testing strategy using Firebase Remote Config. Just briefly though, let's take a look at what a rewarded ad actually looks like, as well as how we use the ad unit ID in code when creating a rewarded ad. So here's a sample rewarded ad playing in our sample app. It shows up whenever we switch between different tabs in the current view, and if a user watches the ad until the end, they get a reward. Let's look at the code that implements this rewarded ad. So in this case, we're looking at code for an Android app, but it will be very similar if you're developing for iOS or Unity. If you followed along with the Getting Started guides for your platform to implement this ad, the code you wrote will look very similar to what's being shown here. There are two key things to call out. One is how we're creating the rewarded ad via the create and load rewarded ad method. The other is the ad unit ID that we're passing in as a parameter to that method when we create the ad. In the create and load rewarded ad method, we're creating the rewarded ad by passing in the activity context and the ad unit ID. The ad unit ID specifies which rewarded ad we want to load up. For now, we're using a sample ad unit ID, but this will change soon once we start running our tests. Next, we're creating a rewarded ad load callback, and finally, we're loading the rewarded ad itself via the load ad call. Okay, now that we know a bit more about how rewarded ads work in code, especially how they're keyed off the ad unit IDs, let's learn about how we can use A/B testing and remote config parameters to control which ad unit ID we load for a given user. So here we are in the Firebase console with my project open. Let's go down to the remote config section where we can create some parameters. After clicking on remote config in the navigation bar, I'm presented with a screen where I can enter the name of the parameter that controls the ad unit ID. I'll keep it simple and just use ad unit ID. Now by default, the value we want to use here is the ad unit ID of our first rewarded ad, the one that shows an ad every 20 minutes. So I'll paste that in. Let's click on add parameter now to create the parameter, and then click on publish changes to make this parameter available to our users. Now we're ready to create our A/B test. We'll click on this overflow menu here and select A/B test. This will open up the A/B test setup screen. And the first thing I'll do here is name the test, and I'll call it add frequency experiment, and then click on next. Now here's where I can make sure that only a small subset of our users experience our changes. Let's increase this target value to 10%, meaning only 10% of our users we placed into this experiment and might see more ads. Now we'll click on next once more, and this takes us to the goal section of our A/B test. Now in our case, we want to increase revenue, so let's set our primary metric as estimated AdMob revenue. A/B testing will base its evaluation of our two variants on this metric. However, ad revenue isn't the only thing we want to keep an eye on, so we'll also include secondary metrics like user retention, because we like having users, as well as purchase revenue for good measure. And finally, I'll hit next, and now I can define our A/B testing variants. So for the control group, we'll use the default value, which is the ad unit ID for our first rewarded ad. For the second testing variant, called variant A, we'll set its value to be the ad unit ID of the second rewarded ad, the one that shows ads more frequently. And finally, we'll hit review. Once we're satisfied with the experiment configuration, we're ready to start the experiment. But there's one last remaining step. We haven't wired up our application code to use the remote config parameter yet. Rachel, can you show us how it's done?
Of course. Now, just a reminder, we're using Android and code samples in Java here, but this setup will be very similar for any other platform. As always, though, links to the docs are in the description in case you want to set up remote config for your own platform and follow along. So first, we'll instantiate the Firebase remote config object and configure how often to retrieve any remote config parameter values waiting to be fetched by our client app. And here, we're creating a remote config settings object via the builder and setting a fetch interval of about once an hour. Now, this interval is okay for our sample app, but in production, you might want to increase this so that your app doesn't exceed any rate limits in hitting the remote config servers. The next thing to do is actually fetch and activate our remote config parameter values. This call will retrieve any pending values for a client, as well as have remote continue checking for updates going forward. Okay, with all that done, let's actually use that remote config parameter that we created in the Firebase console just a bit ago. Quick reminder, it was called add unit ID. We'll go ahead and call getString from our remote config instance and pass in the add unit ID key. Now this key will have the same value as our parameter name, add unit ID. The getString call will return whatever value for that parameter remote config retrieves for this app instance, which will be one of our ad's add unit IDs. We'll store that value in a string we'll call add ID. Now, with this configuration, the value of add ID for each user will actually be controlled by A/B testing. So if A/B testing places a given user in that lucky 10% in our experiment, that user will get one of the two variants, meaning their add ID will be either one of our two add unit IDs. If they get the second add unit ID, they'll see more ads. Now, let's go back to the code snippet for our rewarded ad. We'll pass in this add ID value that we fetch from remote config so that we can create and load the ad variant that A/B testing wants our user to experience. And there you have it. We've got our control in place for which ad experience is shown to users. Firebase remote config and A/B testing will take care of distributing the ad variants to our target users just as we configured at our A/B test. But there is one last step. Back to you, Sumit, for that final piece.
Right. So we've got everything wired up, and we've already set up our A/B test in the console, but we haven't started running the test yet. Let's change that by going back to the console and hitting the Start Experiment button. And boom, we are off to the races. Now, Firebase A/B testing can take at least a couple of weeks before it retrieves some meaningful results. But as time passes, we can always come back to this experiment summary screen to view the performance of our variants. Eventually, if one of the variants is clearly outperforming the other, A/B testing will notify us so that we can decide if we want to roll out that variant as the new control to the rest of our user base. Until then, though, we can also check out the improvement overview and the experiment results section to see if there's a major difference in AdMob revenue and user retention between the two variants over time. That wraps it up for how we can solve our first question, but we've still got our second question left to solve, and that is, what is the optimal number of gems to give away in our rewarded ads? Hopefully, we can increase ad revenue without compromising our other revenue stream, in-app purchases.
Well, Sumit, the good news is that since we've already built out a testing framework using Firebase, the setup to answer this question is quite a bit easier to implement. To answer this question, we'll need to eventually set up another testing variant in A/B testing, which means that we need another rewarded ad to associate with that variant. So, back to our AdMob account to create that ad. But this time, let's increase the number of gems we reward. Here in the AdMob console, we'll run through the rewarded ad creation setup just really quick. We'll name this new ad Rewarded Ads 3000 Gems and enter 3000 for the reward amount. We'll make sure that the frequency capping is enabled, and we'll set this to the same as our controls frequency, one ad every 20 minutes. That means that we're not going to cross streams when we do our testing. And finally, we'll create the ad. And once again, we'll note this ad's add unit ID. Next, we'll go back to the Firebase console to set up a new A/B test that has a variant associated with this new ad.
Back in the remote config section, we already have that add unit ID parameter here, and we're still running the add frequency experiment that we created earlier. But now we want to create a new rewarded amount experiment using the same parameter. So we'll click on the overflow menu and select A/B test. Now we'll set up this A/B test in exactly the same way as we did for the previous experiment. So I'll fast forward through that part. There is one key difference though. In the goals section, we'll set total estimated revenue as the primary metric instead of estimated AdMob revenue. We'll still include both estimated AdMob revenue and purchase revenue as secondary metrics though, since it'll also be useful to measure the impact to these metrics in each variant individually. And of course, we'll also include user retention as well. Now for our testing variants. For the control, we'll use the add unit ID of the very first rewarded ad that rewards 1000 gems. And for the variant, we'll use the add unit ID of the ad that rewards 3000 gems. Then we'll just hit review and finally start the experiment. But what's that, you say? We haven't wired up the code for the new experiment. Actually, we have. Remember the previous code we set up for our first experiment? Well, we can reuse that code exactly as it is to run our second experiment, and in parallel too. This is because remote config and A/B testing work together to provide different add unit ID parameter values to users while attributing them back to the correct A/B testing experiment. And what makes this particularly nice is that we don't have to redeploy our code or re-release our app to just run a new experiment for optimizing our ad revenue for our rewarded ads. Pretty cool, right?
It definitely is. So now, with a basic understanding of how all these products work together, we can start answering a lot more questions about optimizing ad revenue. Questions like, which other ad formats could increase our ad revenue? Or how can we target ads to specific user audiences, not just a random 10% of users? And we can even optimize which users get shown an ad and which ones are escorted to an in app purchase experience instead.
Well, we've got more good news for you. This video will be the first in an upcoming series where we can cover some of these more advanced topics. We'll also walk through some of the concepts presented in this video, step by step, for all supported platforms, whether that's iOS, Unity, or Android.
So stay tuned for those and let us know if you enjoyed this content by dropping us a like or subscribing to the Firebase YouTube channel. Ta-ta for now.
Bye!